Hi, everybody. This is Kate here with Glazer's Camera in Seattle, your local camera store here in Seattle, but of course, we sell products online too. And today we are excited to talk about some of the newest products from Fujifilm, highlighting the new GFX100S and the new, much awaited for 80mm 1.7 lens. We have a bunch of people with us today, so I want to take a moment to introduce those folks in just a second. If you have questions during this live presentation, get those posted in the YouTube chat or on the Facebook comments, and we'll do some Q&A at different points throughout the live feed. But definitely don't be shy with your questions if you have them. So first up, we're going to introduce Michael Blavenko, who you have probably seen before with other events that we've done with Fujifilm, both virtually and here in the store. Michael, maybe just take a moment and tell us a little bit about you and your role at Fujifilm, and then I'll introduce the next person.
Yeah, hi. I am the professional markets training manager. I've been with the company. It's going to be 30 years in 2 months. So
Wow.
I go way back to good old film days. But I come from a background of being a commercial photographer and a videographer as well. And I do a lot of educational content and help with new product development.
Awesome. Okay. Also on with us, we have Mr. Jeff Henze, who is, God, Jeff, you're going to have to remind me of what your title is. But Jeff, I know through events here in the Pacific Northwest. He's based in the Pacific Northwest, and he works with a lot of dealers and does sales and helps with events and like so many different things. So Jeff, tell us a little bit about you and your role at Fujifilm.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I'm Jeff Hinze. I'm the local rep here in Seattle, Washington. I cover from Northern California up here to the Pacific Northwest, and I live here in the Seattle area. And I'm another old timer also. I'll be 22 years with Fuji
Wow.
right now, so 22 years.
That's really great. And also from Fujifilm, we have Luis Navarro, who's going to be leading the primary presentation to talk about some of those tech specs that you might love about the new GFX100S. So Luis, tell us a little bit about you and what you do with Fujifilm.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm the Senior Product Specialist here in Southern California. I support our dealers. I support our sales reps across the country. Mostly I try to stay here in the Western region of America here in the US. I've started when we introduced back mid 90s, our Fujix 650, our digital camera. Back then it was a whopping 3 megapixel. I think it sold around 24,000 now. It's amazing how far we've gone to our technology, what we currently have.
Right.
So yes, thank you.
Okay.
That's 24 million, Louis.
24 million, yes, sure. Yeah.
That's what it goes for now, right?
26 million, actually. So.
And then also we have a super special guest. We have a Fujifilm ex-photographer named Bryan Minear, and please, Bryan, forgive me if I am mispronouncing your last name. He's going to share some of the work that he's created on the GFX100S, and I think also that 80mm lens. And so Bryan, if you want to say hi real quick and just tell us a little bit about you and what you do.
You nailed my last name, so thank you.
Yay!
Yeah, I'm Bryan Minear. I'm based in Michigan, in the Midwest of the United States, and I've been an ex-photographer since, I think, 2015, a fine art and landscape photographer. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I didn't get to shoot with the 80. I only had the GFX100S,
Okay.
but I'm really excited to get my hands on it.
Right. Well, I have people asking me when I'm going to get to look at it, and I'm like, not for a while. Unfortunately, one of these days. But I do have a couple of friends who already put their name down for one. So maybe when they get it, I'll get to play with it. All right, well, let's get this started. Luis, I'm gonna kick this over to you so we can get started on the presentation. Just a reminder, folks, if you have questions, get those posted in the comments. We'll do a little bit of Q&A at different points throughout the presentation, so don't be shy. We'll do our best to answer all of the questions that you have. So Luis, let's get started with your presentation.
All right, thank you, Kate. So I'm going to start with the GFX100S body, and the only one, so I have not played with the camera. Michael, who has played with the camera and the lens, so he will give his input on the presentation about the camera in comparison to the size. So here we go. Let's Gonna get this going. Give me a second, it's running a little bit slow. So the key features on this camera is definitely a form factor, the size, how compact. I think that's what makes it different from our other GFX cameras. It's currently using the same 102 megapixel sensor as the GFX100, same processor. One thing that's very exceptional in low light, IBIS has been improved using a new IBIS system. And then also the video is identical to the GFX100, 12-bit ProRes RAW, coming out with a HDMI out. One thing we keep all of our GFX is weather resistant. This is built on magnesium alloy body. It is about 1 millimeter thick, so it's very durable. It's capable to operate in cold weather, up to 14 degrees, high humidity, any kind of environment that's required for this camera to perform.
And about
Here's a comparison.
60 points of weather sealing.
Yeah, 60 points of weather sealing from throughout the body itself. This is a comparison with the GFX100S, with our camera that started a few years back. The difference is you don't see the hump from the rear. That's the LCD, so it's more trimmed, a little more profile from the eyepiece, electronic viewfinder. Also, what's different too, what's unique is this has a mode dial, a PSM dial, and then we have a improved 1-point-inch display that controls your ISO and your shutter control. Looking at the electronic viewfinder, it's a 3.69 million dots. Difference from your GFX100, this is fixed to the camera. It allows us to be very compact, low profile to the body of the camera. Also, what's different from our other cameras, we actually have 2.3 million dots of LCD three-way tilting. So it goes from 180 to portrait mode and actually flex it a little bit more on the portrait mode in the angle. Also, we're trying something new is our new AF leveler. So this controls your focusing points and other things, but it's something new I haven't tried. So we definitely will ask Bryan how he compares this from other joysticks on our systems.
It's a little fatter than what you find on our other camera bodies, so it takes up more. It's easier to use with gloves.
And that's really good, especially when Bryan's out of Michigan, cold weather. I'm sure he's happy about that. So on the left of the body on the camera, we do have our 3.5 mic headphone jack. Then we have a USB-C and micro HDMI. And again, you could power the camera through the USB-C and tether high speed. Instead of having the PC sync connection on the front of the body, it's actually behind the door, keeps it sealed from the weather. And also to the right, we do have a 2.5 remote release if you want to remotely control the camera itself from a cable. And then we also have a dual SD slot, UHS 2 card slot there. So we currently are using our new battery that we introduced on the XT4. It's our NPW235. It does give us a great live performance, 460 frames. You can use the same dual charger. So one thing about this camera, there is no vertical grip on this camera. So there is only optional. We have a metal grip with that is really Arca Swiss design, but no vertical portrait grip. So that kind of what separates this camera from the 100. As the GFX100, we have the same BSI CMOS sensor, G-mount, a quad 4 processor, very fast focusing. It has a 3.78 million pixels to operate that process.
And the autofocus covers the entire sensor corner to corner.
So the difference between the two cameras, the GFX100 to the GFX100S, it is a fixed EV. It does have a smaller shutter mechanism, so it is a new redesigned shutter mechanism, very quiet. IBIS, that is also compact and a lot smaller. Crop-wise, it's the same as the GFX100. Difference too is our new battery. So like I mentioned earlier, there is no vertical built-in grip. The body size, what makes a difference, it is definitely more compact. It's much lighter, from 1,400 grams to 900 grams. So what people want to know what the S stands for in the 100S, you could say it's small, steady, very light, compact design. Here's a comparison. So side to side, camera between the 100 to the S is 5 grams lighter and 30% smaller.
Hey, Louis, can I show my two images?
Yes, go right ahead.
Let go of your screen
I'm going to stop screen.
because they're relevant. So this is side by side with our S5 Pro, which was an APS-C DSLR, okay? And if you look, it's clearly shorter than an APS-C DSLR. Here on the left is the GFX100S, and that's the XT3 next to it. You can see it's just barely bigger. And the image on the right is to show you how much thinner it is. That camera on the right is another manufacturer's full frame DSLR. And you can see this thing is smaller than a full frame DSLR. It's really, really quite amazing. Go ahead, Louis.
Okay, thank you. Get this going again. Give me a second. So here's a comparison side by side, the mechanism between the two IBIS that we improved in the 100S. So it is 20% smaller and 10% lighter. So comparison is that's also being smaller allows us to get a more compact size of our camera body. So when you pair it with our new 80mm lens, it's a nice combination. But when you compare it to the GFX100, if you're using the 250 lens, the GF 250, you might have a better hold on the GFX100. That's because of the size and the grip itself. And this is a quick chart giving you the comparison of 6.0. For the majority of the lenses, you're getting the six stops stabilization from each lens. The only difference is the 250 and the 100-200. Shutter mechanism, again, is 22% smaller, 60% lighter. Just a quick glance, we did improvement on the release time lag. And also in low light on PADF, we have a minus 5.5 EV with the 1.7 80mm lens. We also improved AF tracking, eye detection, and we also from eye to eye detection has been improved on the 100S. And one thing that's new too is we added a additional film simulation. So it makes it now, I think, total of 19 nostalgic negative. So what it does, it gives you the days of 1970s, 1980s, the days when you're using color film negative and printing back in those days, gives you more of your cyan look of your skies. I remember the days I was printing back in 1970, sent it to my lab with my color film. Those are the days when we had the round corners on our prints. It does resemble to a lot of those prints. Actually, I could pull them out and they look that type of tonality, contrast. And so it gives you a more warmer look, softer tonality and amber look. So it's another nice look. I think some people might call it more cinematic look, but I think everybody individually will have a different, I don't know, present of a particular look that they might have done back in those days, 30, 40 years ago. So performance for video. So just like the GFX100, it will do DCI 4K 30p. You could do F-Log and HLG, and then external, you could do ProRes RAW with HDMI, here picturing with a Atomos 5. One thing about the size of the sensor comparison to your, I would say, to your ARRI, you're considered another large format. It definitely captures a lot cinematic look. I'll give Michael, maybe you want a couple of feedback since you kind of experience more with the video.
Well, so one of the nice things, actually, Hollywood has been moving more and more towards larger and larger sensors the last couple of years, again, to differentiate themselves from television. And that's one of the good advantages of having a giant sensor is you get really, really good control of depth of field. With cinema, what a director wants as much as possible is to draw attention to a particular part of the image. It's not just soft backgrounds just to have soft backgrounds. It's to have what you want the audience focusing on. And that's what the main advantage of going with a bigger and bigger sensor is in the cinema world, is being able to separate, a character from the background. And yeah, the video quality on this is quite totally pro compatible because it's 10-bit uncompressed out of the HDMI port. And that's everything that everybody's shooting on broadcast TV these days anyway. So, and the film simulations just make your life easy. You can do F-Log and you can do ProRes RAW, but if you're a one-man crew or a one-woman crew, you can save yourself a lot of money and time by not having to do color grading later.
Thank you, Michael. So on this slide, we are going to release the camera. So on the embargo lifts for sale, March 11th. So that's next month. So we're maybe a month away. Price is $5,999.95. So I don't know if you've been reading the social media. It's been highly demand for this camera worldwide. So if you're really interested in this camera, definitely reach out to Glazers to have your pre-order. Probably the first camera for this price, for this performance. It's really unheard of. So nice thing about it is the difference between the GFX100. So we have a new mode dial. So it's weather resistant. We do have IBIS with 6 stops, smaller focal plane. We have a new battery. So it really performs like a lot of our mirrorless cameras, very responsive, just giving you that beautiful bokeh, that compression, that look that large sensor gives you. But just to give you more of a samples, that's what we have. Bryan, who really has tested our camera, is put it into paces. He's been working with our other medium formats, so he could tell us the comparison and the difference between handling the both performance, image quality, and so on. So I'm going to stop sharing and have Bryan can start his presentation.
And before Bryan starts, I want to say something in the way of support for him. For those of you out there that have been Fujifilm fans for a while, you've been seeing a lot of Bryan's images and probably didn't know it was his work. He's been one of our primary contributors now for many years to the stuff you see in trade shows and our marketing materials. So it's a real pleasure to have him finally talk about how he does stuff.
Before we get to you, Bryan, let's just ask a question that has come in on the Q&A bit. People are curious about the price difference from the GFX100 to the GFX100S when this seems like an upgrade. So with the 100, can you speak to if that model will still be in circulation, or if maybe this replaces that, or if you see the price coming down on the original GFX100?
At this point in time, we don't have any information from Japan of whether there's going to be a price move or not. I kind of doubt it. The GFX100 is not going away. There are the ergonomics of it and the dual batteries and the integrated vertical grip and the removable viewfinder. There's certain things about that body that do appeal to photographers that are different. The GFX100S, it's an upgrade in some of the specs, but that's really only in the IBIS and the size.
Right.
Other than that, there's no difference in image quality at all between them. So
Well, and it sounds like some of those features you mentioned kind of set the X1, the original GFX 100 kind of apart, which is part of that, because they're asking about like the price difference. So that is part of the price difference, is some of the longevity with having the dual batteries and that kind of thing. So
yeah,
hopefully
just
that helps
it's a
answer your question, Christopher. And then we just have someone who just wants to share the love. Petronella Photography said she loved being part of the beta team to use the GFX100S, and she's anxiously awaiting to get hers in March. So thanks for sharing that. And with that said, we'll go over to Bryan. Bryan, please share with us I know you have some images to share, and you're going to talk about those. And again, for those of you tuning in, if you have questions during this part, please get those posted in the chat, and we'll do a little bit of Q&A as we can. All right, Bryan, I'm going to send this over to you now.
Thank you very much. Okay, got my screen. Awesome. Well, first off, thank you, Glazers. Thank you, Michael, for the kind words. I appreciate it. It's cool to be on I think this is probably the biggest launch I've ever been a part of, so it's really exciting. And I'm just excited to be here with you to share my thoughts on this camera, because it was incredible. I had it for roughly 3 weeks or so. And I just want to say, like, I love when Fujifilm gives me a project like this, because I feel like I'm kind of pushed to create some of my best work with a tight deadline like that. So with all of that said, we've gone through the specs and everything. I just want to kind of tell you my story with the camera. I know Michael showed you some size comparisons. Well, that's honestly one of the things that blew me away the most when I first took this thing out of the box. Being a landscape photographer who, well, when I travel when I can, COVID aside, size matters. I've taken the GFX100 with me on a couple trips before, and it's great. The image quality is outstanding, but it kind of messes with my flow a little bit. It doesn't really fit in any of my camera bags. I love this because it fits right next to my X-T4. It shares a battery with the X-T4. And I feel like for a photographer who's always going to be back and forth between the two, it's really the perfect companion. So like I said, this camera arrived on my doorstep right around the end of December. I live in Michigan, so it's not exactly known for its scenery, but it's also very, what do you say, unpredictable when it comes to the kind of weather we're going to get. So, I knew back when they told me that the camera was going to be coming that I was probably going to need to travel somewhere just to be able to show off all the camera can do. I settled on a 4-day trip to Arizona. We're going to get to that, but thankfully, amidst the unpredictable winter that I like to call permacloud here, the sun peeked out a couple times, and I was really able to get acclimated with the camera before I traveled somewhere with it. This was shot with the GF 100 to 200 millimeter lens. That's probably going to be one of the lenses that I purchased with this camera, because I just love it. I love telephoto so much. But the thing that really kind of stood out to me when I first started playing around with this camera is the PASM dial. So I'm going to admit straight up, I was kind of hesitant at first because it does away with the ISO and the shutter speed dials that I've kind of grown to love so much. But after having time to shoot with it and really feel it out, you get acclimated super quickly to how the various functions of the camera work. And it's really a joy to shoot with. So what I'm most excited about when it comes to this camera is, and the PASM dial, is the expansion of the custom modes. So in the past, anybody who shot with a Fujifilm camera knows that custom modes are kind of primarily for JPEG recipes, right? Setting up different JPEG simulations and being able to switch back and forth between them. But with this new custom dial, you can program any feature of the camera, the drive mode, the metering, selfie timer, exposure settings, just anything, to a custom setting on that dial, so you can quickly switch back and forth between it. So it's a huge benefit for the way that I like to shoot, because anytime that I can save, not having to dig through a menu or switch something on or off is super helpful. Here's a couple examples of how I set the camera up out of the box. So, you can see I did a lot, right? I set 5 of the 6 available settings. It just, depending on what I'm shooting, I'm usually in manual mode and multimetering. But like if I'm shooting the sun or the moon, I switch to spot metering, and I bracket just so I have a little more leeway with my exposures. And you can see that my C4 setting kind of does all that. It switches to spot metering for me. It switches the camera into bracketing mode, amongst other things. I also shoot astro a lot, which I'm going to show you some more images from Arizona. So in my C2, like being able to switch to that, switch, literally rotate a dial and have it automatically dial up my ISO, pull down my shutter speed, as well as turn on the selfie timer, turn the camera IBIS on, the long exposure noise reduction off, it, like all by just doing this, is awesome. So I think it's really awesome for photographers who shoot a lot of different kinds of things and switch quickly between those things without missing a beat. So I was assigned 3 lenses for this project. So everything that you see in this presentation from this point on was shot with those 3 lenses. I had the 23 millimeter f4, the 30 millimeter 3.5, and then the 120 millimeter f4. So I had a pretty good assortment as far as focal lengths go. Of the 3, I had the least amount of experience with the 120, but I am a telephoto shooter. I love shooting with telephoto lenses. So I knew that I would kind of have to grow to love it quickly, since it was my only option of significant length. And you can see even with a 120 millimeter lens and then that 100 megapixel resolution, how close you can really get to even the moon. And so thankfully, like I said, when the sun came out, I had a couple of chances where I could really get acclimated with the camera before I left. And that 120 was like, it was perfect. And I'm not really a macro shooter at all, but between the 100 megapixel resolution and the macro capabilities of that lens, I had fun experimenting, just making weird images like this.
Hey, Brian, I'm
Okay,
going to
so
ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I think there's probably a lot of people out there, because you mentioned your preset customs. What you're showing us here, how much of this is straight out of camera? How much of this is post-processed?
So you're seeing everything that I showed you up to this point were edited JPEGs. So just, you know, I'm kind of, how do I say it? I like to take liberties. I'm more of an artist. I don't really care what other people think. I just make the art that appeals to me. And post-processing is a big part of my workflow. So pretty much from everything you see in Arizona was processed in RAW, and then everything prior that I've shown you was edited JPEGs with not a ton of tweaking. I just have I have a color palette and a contrast, and you know, that I like to use in post to put on my images. Does that answer your question? Cool. All right, so day one, I flew from Detroit to Phoenix. I hopped in my rental car and drove north to Prescott, and destination 1 was this beautiful place called Watson Lake. And I had found it in my research. I'd never been there before, but I don't know, it just, the uniqueness of the landscape just called out to me. And so I showed up pretty early. I got there mid-afternoon. So I had plenty of time to scout my spot. Like, I knew where I wanted to be for the sunset. Like I said, I spent like 2 hours, I think, walking around, just climbing on rocks. This place is huge. And I just wanted to really get a feel for it and decide what focal length was going to work best and where, you know, I knew in this trip, I only had 4 days of shooting. So I really needed to be able to know what I was going to do so I didn't miss something obvious. You know, one of the things that always stands out to me in the West compared to where I live in the Midwest, you know, I'm usually forced to shoot into the sun for everything, just because the landscape around here is pretty uninteresting. But in a place like this, knowing that the sunset light is just going to light up the textures is awesome. But it's just a total mindset shift when you're traveling across the US like that. And the rocks lit up exactly as I hoped they would. Most of these are shot with the GF120 lens. I took to it pretty much as quickly as I expected to. I just really love shooting these vast landscapes and compressing layers together. I just feel like it gives you this massive sense of scale. And I shot most everything in this presentation in 16-bit RAW. I feel like that's really one of the standout features of this camera for me. Having that depth of tonality and color when you're processing raw images is like nothing I've ever experienced before. So for a person who considers post-processing a huge part of the art process, this is just the perfect camera for me. I called it the landscape photography camera of my dreams, and that's not like an overstatement in the slightest. So once the amazing light ended and the sun had set, I got this beautiful pink glow. Again, a testament to the IBIS of this camera. Even with the 120 millimeter lens, like being able to handhold twilight shots is something I'm just so used to throwing my camera on a tripod. So this was crazy unique experience for me, but I really wanted to push it to its limits and see what I was able to do. I knew there was a good chance that someone was going to kick me out of this park after dark because there was a gate, but I decided I wanted to stay around and try to shoot some astro. I'd experimented a little bit with astrophotography on the GFX100, but not much. I think the large sensor presents an interesting, an interesting challenges, being that there's so much resolution. The maximum time that I could have my shutter open for before the stars started to blur from the rotation of the Earth on the GF 30 millimeter lens was like 8 to 10 seconds. So that's not a huge amount of time when it comes to astrophotography. So I ended up having to bump the ISO up, and that's, again, this thing shines. I think this shot was ISO 8000. So being able to push the ISO that much and still come away with a really, great image from a noise perspective is awesome.
Hey, Bryan.
So yeah.
In some of these shots, I just want to clarify, I'm willing to bet that people watching this on Facebook are seeing some color banding in the skies. That's not in the files.
No, definitely not. If you want to go check out I have a blog post on my website, bryanminear.com. And you can check out these in full. I'm sure it's probably just the web compression from the video on Facebook and YouTube. There's definitely no color banding. That's one of the beautiful things about the 16-bit RAW is just the gradation and fall off of color between colors is incredible, which makes it literally a perfect camera for landscape photography. So here's another example of astrophotography. This is day 2, the morning of day 2 before sunrise. I drove to Sedona and decided to swap that 30 millimeter lens out for the 23 just to experiment. A wider field of view like that meant that I could increase my my shutter speed to around 15 seconds, even though I was losing the half stop there on light gathering abilities from the lens. I decided just to I was playing around at this point, right? I'm trying to feel it out. This end result is actually 2 exposures stacked. So the foreground of the rocks was shot at 25 seconds just to bring up some of that color and lighting on the rocks. And then the stars was shot at 15 seconds, and I merged those together in post. So I didn't have a ton of time to spend here. I wanted to hike up on the rock that you see on the right, which is Bell Rock. I wanted to hike up and onto that to have kind of a panoramic view of the red rocks surrounding me. So typically I'm hunting clouds, and this is day 2 of just completely clear skies, which it is what it is, but I just felt like seeing the colors come up. I mean, having all these cactuses in the foreground, just like it blew my mind getting to experience a sunrise like that. And again, I'm shooting handheld with this stuff at a point where previously in my career, I've been hauling around the GFX100S, and that is almost always a guarantee that I'm going to be on a tripod. The IBIS just comes in a big way for me being able to move around freely and shoot and not have to worry about always setting up on a tripod all the time. So after that, I knew I had a 4.5-hour drive north up towards Page, Arizona. I was heading to a place called White Pocket, which was kind of the pinnacle of this trip for me. I wanted to go there for a really long time. So I worked my way back around Bell Rock, just kind of shooting as I went. I took a couple panoramic shots of just the light coming up on the mountains. And it was really, I don't know, it was beautiful. I think one of the things that I love about landscape photography is just being out there and in the moment and experiencing just the beauty that Earth has to offer. And I think, again, going back to the size of the camera, just being able to be out there with such a light kit, but such a incredibly powerful and light kit, it just makes the experience that much better. So I didn't have any, I wasn't planning on stopping along the way. I knew I had such a long drive, but as I started driving north, I noticed I was driving north towards Flagstaff. I started to notice the way the light was falling into the valley. And I was right by this park called Slide Rock State Park. I'd been there on a previous trip and it was snowing, ironically, in Arizona, which was weird. But I figured I'd make a quick stop there because there's a couple waterfalls. They're smaller waterfalls, but just the way the light was illuminating the mountains in the background, I felt like I should probably stop and try it out just to, again, show another way in which this camera, can perform. So This I shot with, I think a 10-stop ND filter and then a 3-stop ND grad to bring some of the exposure down, you know, to match. Because I mean, you can tell from this shot before, the foreground is in complete shadow and then the background is incredibly bright. So just being able to, you know, even out those exposures was super helpful. And I think, you know, going back to the incredible tonality, that's something that just it stood out to me throughout this experience with the camera. Just being able to pull up shadows. I come from kind of a world where I'm always bracketing exposures with the X series cameras just to maximize my dynamic range while also limiting the amount of noise that I'm introducing into images. And I feel like with the GFX100S, there isn't a scene like this where I would need to bracket because it just has such a huge amount of tonal range off of that 100 megapixel sensor. So this kind of this is White Pocket. This was like going to another planet. I drove 4.5 hours north from Sedona and I met a guide who drove me, I think it's only like 7 to, I mean, maybe 15 miles, but it took us 2-ish hours to get out there just because the road is all sand and clay. And it's, you know, you have to, if you don't have a really high clearance 4-wheel drive vehicle, you can't get out there without a guide. So I hired someone professionally to take me out there so I didn't end up getting stuck in a place where I didn't have service. But you get out there and it's just like nothing you've ever seen before. Everybody, when I was in contact with the team over at Fujifilm, they kept saying, how did you get to Mars? Which is really what it felt like when you were there. But again, even this, like I'm a golden hour shooter. And then after dark, I don't really shoot blue skies during the day, but the combination of just the colors and the tonality that the sensor is able to capture, and then just being in a unique place like this, I was walking around snapping just shots that I normally wouldn't get. And the 23 millimeter really shined for me here. There was just so much texture that you could frame as a nice leading foreground. I just felt like a total kid in a candy store, you know, walking around this place. And there were a lot of wispy clouds you can kind of see in the sky. We had, it looks like about a 50-50 chance of whether we were going to get this amazing sunset burn. But then the longer we waited, it kind of died out and it looked like it was just going to completely fizzle. You can see here, this is right before the sun was about to set. The little character there you can see standing in the background, that was my tour guide, Sunny. She went out and posed for me for this shot just to show off the massive scale of this place. But again, even in kind of low light situations where the sun's kind of glowing through a little bit, it just, the colors lit up completely. And again, that's a huge testament to just the color you can get off the sensor. This is just a slightly tweaked Velvia JPEG straight out of the camera. And then right at sunset, I was just completely stunned. I took this wide shot. This was shot with the GF 30 millimeter lens. And I was just completely astonished that we got any kind of color whatsoever. Off in the background there, the real dark ridge line in the background is called Grand Staircase Escalante. It's a national park or a national something in southern Utah. And so you could see like the colors there. I bet the sunset that was happening over there in Bryce Canyon was like absolutely amazing. But we could catch a little bit of it here, which was awesome. I ended up, after this shot, I switched over to the GF120. And as soon as I looked through the EVF of the camera, I knew it was going to be like my trophy shot of the entire trip. So just like that, after I snapped this image, I felt like I could have left Arizona at that point and it would have been completely worth the trip. But once I got back to my hotel and Page, I dumped my cards and kind of started researching what I could do for the morning after. And this is where I finally, I knew this was my trophy shot. I dumped my cards and I started looking at some of these images. And that's where the 16-bit RAW just like really blew me away. This is a single RAW file. The dynamic range completely just is awesome. Absolutely. I'm kind of a shooter. I talked a little bit earlier, like with Michael, I like to take liberties with my editing process. That's just so much of the fun for me. And I like to go really dark. I like to conceal things away in shadows to a point where you can still see detail in them. And so this image was like the holy grail for me. So the next morning, I woke up and I thought I was going to take it pretty easy. I went to this lookout point that was overlooking the southern end of Lake Powell, and you can see a marina there in the foreground to the left. But as soon as I snapped a couple shots and saw this glow from the impending sunrise, I was like, this is probably going to be the best. This is like Bryan cloud junkie conditions right here. This is like the holy grail of sunrises. And so I was like, I got this shot. I can't just sit here and shoot this same composition over and over again throughout this beautiful sunrise. So my guide had actually told me about a location that was about 25 minutes away from here called the Toadstools. It's like a rock formation. And I was looking at my watch, like, am I gonna make it? Because even once you get to the parking lot, it's like a mile hike out to it. So I hightailed it as fast as I could and ran out, and thankfully got there like right as the sun started to rise and all this amazing color in the sky. And this was like the first. I set my camera up on the tripod and took one image, and just to kind of get a reading of what all was going on. It ended up being one of my favorite shots. And then I started moving around looking for composition. So one of the things I think that I like to talk about is just being flexible on a photo trip like this, never knowing what's going to happen and being open to changing your plans. You don't always have to follow exactly your itinerary. I changed up a lot of things on this trip just as conditions allowed, and I feel like it really allowed me to kind of push the limits of what I was able to capture while I was on this trip. So I had the camera set up. I knew I found this one particular composition, and I was just waiting for the sun to come up over the ridgeline so that I could snap a sun star image. This 23mm lens has a beautiful sun star at f32. So I waited and waited, and finally I got the shot that I wanted. And after I got this shot, I hopped back in my car and prepped for another 4.5-hour drive back towards the south rim of the Grand Canyon. I think over the course of this 4-day trip, I put 1,049 miles on my rental car. It's a ton, but none of the experiences that I had let me down in any way. I came away with at least one good image from each stop, which is something that I can't say always happened. So 4.5 hours later, I arrive at the south rim of the Grand Canyon. I arrived early again. It gave me plenty of time to scout. This time of the year is off season at the Grand Canyon, and there's a road called Hermit Road that is normally only accessible by shuttle bus. It's open to all cars, so I had direct access to every single lookout point that the South Rim has to offer, which is really cool. I just had to pick one. So after driving all the way to the very end and then back, I decided on this lookout point called Mojave Point, and it was going to be kind of my winner. So I just kind of set up shop and waited for the sun and the light to get good and started snapping images. And I just sat for a long time just picking out interesting light and textures with that 120mm lens. Again, these images are Velvia, slightly edited JPEGs. Just the colors that you get there, it was so painterly, everything about it. And I think a lot of that has to do with that amazing, beautiful sensor. This is one of my favorite images from the entire trip, and I can't really put my finger on why. It's something to do with the interesting light patterns that are going on in the background, and then the added depth that you get from the branches in the foreground that are lit up by the sun. This was shot wide open on the 120mm f4 lens. I don't know, there's just everything about the Grand Canyon at this kind of light, it's like a painting. And then the way that the camera captures the colors just continually blew my mind again and again. So it wasn't the best sunset that I'd ever seen, but watching the Grand Canyon descend into darkness at those last few moments of light, I don't know. As a landscape photographer, you're out there because you love being out there. It's not so much about the images as the experience. And so normally, like I said earlier, when the light drops, I switch to shooting on a tripod, but I wanted to push the limit. So I just kept shooting handheld. So this image was shot at 1/6 of a second handheld. Here's 100% crop. It's incredibly sharp. Just again and again, this camera was proving itself to me that it's the landscape photographer's dream camera. I think I only had to bump the ISO up to around 400 for my last couple images, which just speaks to the insane light gathering ability of the larger sensor. And then after the sun had set, I went back to my rental car and waited for the stars to come out. This was going to be the last night that I could shoot any astro at all. And I know typically winter is kind of the wrong time of year to be shooting astro. Number one, the camera launch happened when it happened. I couldn't help that. But also, I'm not really your typical astrophotographer. I don't need the Milky Way, bright as, clear as day, popping in to make an interesting images for me. I just love stars. I've been obsessed. I mean, you see this background of this photo of my son in the background in his astronaut costume. I just love space and everything about it. So I feel like I always say that shooting astro, shooting the moon is the closest I'll ever get to being an astronaut. So that's something that I always push to do. And this, I really feel like I hit my stride here in figuring out the astrophotography capabilities of the camera. So I'm really excited to push it further when I finally do get my own. So we're close to being done. Following sunrise didn't have the direct sunlight that I wanted for that real painterly look in the canyon. It was more of like a soft glowing light because there was a lot of hazy clouds on the horizon. But I mean, it still made for an interesting experience. And then I got to sit on this ledge. This picture doesn't really do it justice, but I was literally just sitting on a ledge with my camera set up on tripods, just like waiting for things to happen. And it's just really beautiful to spend your morning that way. So another thing I want to point out, I'm a landscape photographer. Like autofocus it's not huge for me. I know it's tough to make comparisons to this camera when there isn't really another comparable camera on the market. When you compare it to more expensive medium format cameras, it just completely wipes the floor with them. So in my experiences with this, I'd say it's close to like 90% of what an X-T4 can do, which makes sense because it's the same processor. But the GF lenses have way more glass that need to be pushed around with the autofocus. But I do know that I could never have gotten a shot like this with the GFX100S and its contrast-only phase detection, contrast-only autofocus. And here's 100% crop showing you both the incredible 100 megapixel resolution and the accuracy of the autofocus. Like it was crazy being able to sit there with that 120 millimeter lens and track birds flying across in front of me and being able to get sharp images with it. So as I walked the rim trail to pack the rest of my gear into the car to head back to Phoenix, I got some better shots as the sun kind of rose above those clouds and streamed into the canyon. And I felt like it was a really beautiful goodbye for me at the Grand Canyon. So that's pretty much it. I have a few more images to show you. I instead of going, this would have been Thursday. That was Thursday morning sunrise. I had a 4.5 hour drive back. I wanted to be close to Phoenix because I had a 6 a.m. flight on Friday. And I wanted to shoot that last sunset somewhere cool. So I ended up going to a place called Lost Dutchman State Park, which is overlooking this mountain range called the Superstition Mountains. I'd been here a few times, but never to photograph it. So again, I arrived early afternoon just to scout and figure out what I wanted to do, hike a few of the trails just for fun, and then figure out where my spot was going to be for the sunset. And considering how scenic the entire park is, like I couldn't really go wrong no matter where I ended up. It was 70 degrees and sunny, which is quite the difference from the 20-degree mornings that I'd experienced for the beginning of the trip. But I guess that's like the real magic of Arizona, right? Is just the elevation changes that change the temperature across the state. And I've found on this trip that I am completely and utterly obsessed with cactuses. And that 120 millimeter lens's macro capabilities, again, just continually blew my mind. And especially saguaro cactuses. I don't know, there's something about them that just, it's so weird. It's so incredibly foreign to me being from the Midwest. So I kind of feel like cactuses have the same effect on me that palm trees do for beach people. I'm not really a beach person. I don't think I've ever taken a photo of a palm tree in my life. But one day, this photo right here that I got inspired me that I want to do an entire project that's a tribute to the American Southwest. I just feel like it just has called to me about that area. And it's really this experience that I had with this camera that set that forward. Then as the sun crept lower and lower in the sky, it was clear that Arizona was giving me this crazy send-off. I swear that the sunset lasted for another hour after the sun had officially left the sky. It's just these intense reds and purples just absolutely made my trip. And it was at that point that I noticed the rising crescent moon in the sky. So I started kind of hunting around looking for cool, like small cactuses in the foreground to give that some scale. I honestly felt like I made a year's worth of images in a few days, and I couldn't be happier with the end result of my time with this camera. So that's it. I mean, that's my experience. Hopefully I covered everything and inspired you a little bit. And yeah, if we have any questions, let's go for it.
Well, I'll
You know,
just chime
Brian,
in.
I just want to say that I've been around the state of Michigan. I think the state of Michigan actually has a lot of nice scenery. So,
Hey, but I'm in the not so nice part, right? I'm in like Metro Detroit, so I have to drive 4 to 5 hours to get anything good.
Well, and I'll chime in. I'm actually originally from Atlanta, and back in 2004, 2005, I visited some friends who lived in Salt Lake City. And one of the things we did was we took the day trip or 2 days down to Moab, which, is not that far from where you were shooting. And a year later, I moved to Utah. Because, growing up in a city like Atlanta, probably there's a lot of similarities to Detroit, urban. You have to drive for miles to get to those kinds of landscapes. And the scenery was just so completely different that I was like, okay, I have to experience this more. And I've done a fair bit of travel myself in the Southwest. Like Joshua Tree has become one of my favorite national parks in the country. So anytime I'm going through that area, it's like, okay, I'm going to stop here. I'm staying a few days, and what can I shoot this time? How can I experience it this time? That kind of thing. So seeing a lot of the images that you created kind of like took me back to being in that place and missing my 2 or 3 week road trips around that part of the country for sure. And thank you for sharing all of that. We haven't had too many questions come in so far. One of them is from a gentleman named Bob, who's tuning in on our YouTube channel, and he was asking, is the shutter button touchy like the XH1, or is it a similar to experience working like with the GFX100S or maybe the R? Did you notice anything like that?
Yeah, I feel like when I first had, and this is just personally, I don't know technical, we can ask those guys that. Personally, I remember when I first got the XH1, it was very touchy. And I almost kept like making images by accident, and this did not feel that way. I mean, it's the same kind of, it doesn't have the threaded release built into it, but it definitely is. Yeah, it felt good. It was more comparable to, like an XT4 or something like that for me.
Okay, cool.
hey, Brian, why don't you stop your share? The button is definitely firm. It feels like the GFX100.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, since we don't have any other questions, we'll wrap this up a few minutes early. First of all, I want to thank everyone from Fujifilm who made this happen and joined in on the session today. We always love partnering up with all of our vendor friends in the community, and it's great when we're able to do this and talk about like all this new gear that gets announced. And even though we're not able to do these in person like we normally would, still it just brings that extra bit of excitement and fun, and hopefully gets questions answered for those of you who are curious about the newest gear from Fujifilm. So thank you to Jeff, Lewis, and
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Sure.
So Brian, the early pictures that you showed from Michigan, the horse and some of the before you got, what film simulations were those?
Oh, I was shooting everything in classic negative, I believe. I think I bounced between classic negative and pro neg standard, just because I know when I'm typically, if I'm shooting JPEGs and I know I want to add a little bit of my own thing on top, pro neg standard is usually the best. I was on a Clubhouse with Jonas Rask yesterday, and we started talking about nostalgic negative. And I realized, like, wow, I did a whole thing when I was at the Grand Canyon of comparison shots between like classic negative and nostalgic negative, just for people. I knew people would be asking about it. And then I completely omitted that from my blog post and talking about it, just because there were so many other things to focus on, but I think that nostalgic negative simulation is something that I am going to put through its paces. Like, it's really beautiful, especially in a desert setting like that. It's beautiful, and it's really fun. And especially for me, I mean, if you probably could tell, I kind of tend towards warmer tones anyway. in my post processing. So I think it really definitely stands out to me.
And I guess the other question is, tell us what is in your backpack.
Right now, or what I want to be in my backpack?
Yeah, what
once
did
I
you
get this
have? What did
camera?
you have? Yeah, what
Yeah.
did you have with you?
So for anyone interested, I vlogged this entire trip. So you can go to my YouTube channel and you can watch the whole thing. So I had an X-T4 and the 16mm 1.4 lens, which was my primary kind of vlogging and time-lapse camera. I did a whole lot of time lapses while I was there. And I also had the 50-140 just because it's my favorite X series lens. And I knew my primary was going to be the X100S, and I probably wasn't going to shoot with it, but I can't just leave it at home because it's my favorite lens. So I had, like I said, X-T4, those two lenses, the 16 and the 50-140, and then the GFX100S and the 3 lenses that I mentioned. And then I also brought my X100V just because I can't really go anywhere without that camera. And any of the images of the GFX100S that I showed were shot with the X100V. Something that I'll add, one thing that I want to add to that I kind of omitted from the presentation, I fell in love with the GFX50S from the minute that I first touched it. I was at the launch event in New York City, and from the moment somebody put it into my hands, there was just something about that camera that really, it just spoke to me. And so that's been like my kind of holy grail camera. And I feel like the first moment that I picked up the 100S out of the box that it was in, that's kind of the same feeling that I got. It has an attention to detail and a feel that's really great in hand. But it's so much slimmer. I mean, it's like you put the GFX50S on Slim Fast for a year. It's crazy. It really is the perfect camera from a size and weight perspective for a lot of different types of photographers, not just if you're, interested in landscape photography. And so that's definitely one thing that stood out for me, is just how great it feels compared to some of the other medium format cameras from Fujifilm.
Yeah, I know personally, I'm looking forward to checking it out. I'm a Fuji shooter as well, and I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of the different cameras, and honestly, I've been drooling for the 50R for a while, but I could never justify it with my budget. But now I'm like drooling over this, and I haven't even touched it yet. So,
what's crazy to me is on that Clubhouse that I mentioned with Jonas Rask yesterday, he was telling me that he's selling his 50R to get this camera,
right.
Which is crazy because he was like, the 50R was his camera, and I was even messaging him on Instagram. Because obviously he had the camera, right? So we're talking about it while I was in Arizona, and I was like, yeah, this is my landscape photography dream camera. And I said, much like the 50R was for you. So hearing that even he is interested in having this as his medium format camera of choice was pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just think with the price point and based on the specs and like the feel of what I am anticipating that experience will be like, is I think more and more people are going to be interested in adding this to their lineup, or potentially shifting from other brands to get this 100 megapixels. I mean, if for all the pixel peepers out there, they want it too. So, all right. Well, thank you for all of that. There are a lot of pixels to peep, that is for sure. I still remember when the GFX100 came out, and we did a live demo here. And actually, I photographed a couple of the folks from Fujifilm, and we had a model and all of that. And I just remember processing those files going, God, if I get one of these, I might have to upgrade my computer because my computer is like 6 years old. So anyhow, but all the pixels. So if you want all the pixels, you can also call the store and we can put your name down for one of these when they are available in March. No deposit required. Just put your name on that list if you are interested in picking up the new GFX100S or the 80mm 1.7. So with all that said, thank you, Michael, for those last couple of questions. Thank you so much, Bryan. It's really great that we were able to have you be a part of this event. I've personally followed your work for a long time, so it's nice to meet you and get to have a little chat with you and talk about your work and your process. So that's really beneficial for the people who are tuning in and the people who get to watch this video later. Everyone from Fujifilm, again, thank you so much for your time and energy and all the work to put this together. We are super, super grateful. Before we sign off, I want to mention that on Monday, Louis and I are going to hang out and talk about the other Fujifilm announcements that have been made recently, focusing more on the X series lineup. So the XE4, the XF 27mm f2.8 lens, which now has an aperture ring, and the 70-300, both of which, all of those are weather resistant now too. So if you're curious about other Fujifilm news and gear, go to our website, glazerscamera.com/workshops, and check out the other upcoming events. Register. It'll be a lot of fun, just like this. Hopefully you'll enjoy it as much. Again, gentlemen, thank you all. And for those of you tuning in, thanks so much for being with us today, and we'll see you soon.